There is different ways when talking about estimating. We either use relative value or absolute value. Relative complexity is easier to judge than absolute one. Look at these two dogs. If I ask you which one weighs more than the other, pretty easy, right? But what about if I ask you to tell me how many pounds does each one weigh? This is harder, right? Relative estimation means that we judge how big or complex a task is with respect to other tasks. And one of the units of complexity that can be used in this kind of estimation is the story point. So a story point is a number that tells the team about the effort required to implement in a given user story. One of the important reasons to use the story point estimation instead of absolute estimation in hours or Mondays is that the absolute estimation has a kind of an emotional attachment to it. If you estimate a task to take 10 hours and it ended up taking you 30 hours, then what do you tell your manager? Why did you take more time than planned? This could be frustrating for people, as it could turn to a blaming game if we are not able to finish tasks within the time frame agreed on. Story point estimation removes this emotional attachment by removing the link that we can have towards time. As explained earlier, story points estimation takes into consideration the effort needed to accomplish a task. An estimate of the effort involved can be influenced by the amount of work to do, the risk and uncertainty, and the complexity. In terms of amount of work needed, consider the task of folding papers in two. The first task is to fold 10 papers, and the second task is about folding 100 papers. Although it's the same actions, and the second task is not more complex than the first one, but still, the second task requires more work and should be given more story points. It probably doesn't get 10 times more points, even though there are 10 times as many paper, but it should definitely have more story points. The amount of risk and uncertainty in a user story should affect the story point estimate given to it. If a team is asked to estimate a user story, and if what needs to be done is unclear, then that uncertainty should be reflected in the estimate. And if implementing a user story involves changing a particular piece of old code that has no automated tests in place, for example, that risk should be reflected in the estimate too. Last thing to be considered when estimating is the complexity. Complexity should also be considered when providing a story point estimate. Think back to the earlier example of folding 100 papers instead of 10. Imagine now that the task is to fold 100 paper and make airplanes with it. In this case, even though we are still folding 100 papers, but there is more complexity to it, and it should be reflected in the story point estimation. In most cases, a story point uses the Fibonacci sequence as a scale for sizing. Some teams will use t-shirt sizing as a measure. Story point estimation is typically performed during the product backlog refinement sessions, and the product backlog is evaluated by the team, who is responsible to turn the product backlog items to real customer value. The product owner does not contribute to the estimation, but he will have the responsibility to explain what the product backlog items is about. In order to estimate user stories, each team would have to find 1 or 2 baseline stories as a reference. These user stories don't need to be the smallest ones, but they should be ones that everyone within the team understands and can resonate with. Once defined, estimating all the other user stories should be done by comparing them to the reference user story. So the team will give the reference story a number from the Fibonacci sequence, then they will take the other user stories one by one and each time ask, does this user story require more effort than our reference story? If it's the case, they put it after that user story. Or they ask, will it be less effort than the reference story? And if it's the case, then they put it before. The team can then proceed and give story points to the other user stories. If it requires twice as much effort as the reference story, then we give it double amount of story points. If it's twice less, then we give it less. During the estimation session, it is very important to involve everyone in the team: developers, designers, testers. Each team member brings a different perspective on the product and the work required to deliver a user story. I hope this video gave you a good understanding of story points and why we use relative estimation instead of absolute estimation. Please leave us a comment and follow us for more content. Thank you.